Benue State? Who were the first people to occupy Benue Valley? What is the meaning of Makudi? And why most settlements in Benue State, such as Wurukum, Wadata, and Yelewata, carried names that are either from Tiv, Idoma, Igede, Etulu, or any other ethnic groups in Benue State? Those are the questions I have been receiving recently. But before we answer those questions, there is something we need to understand. When many people hear of Benue Valley, they immediately think of Makudi and Benue State. But the Benue Valley is much bigger than that. The Benue River rises in Cameroon, entered Nigeria from the east, and flows westward across the country until it meets the Niger River at Lokoja. So historically, the Benue Valley stretches across a huge corridor covering parts of what are today Adamawa, Taraba, Benue, Nasarawa, and Kogi states, with connected areas extending toward Cameroon. And right in the middle of this great river system was one of the most important political formations in central Nigeria, the Kwarafa Confederacy. To understand who lived around present-day Makudi before the major expansion of Tiv, we first have to travel back into time, because I know a lot of you are very sentimental with these questions. Everybody wants to know between Tiv and Idoma, who was the first to occupy Benue Valley. Now grab a seat, sit down, and let me walk you through this story. Between roughly the 16th and 18th centuries, the Kwarafa political world was one of the most powerful forces in the Middle Benue region. Its heartland was associated with the Jukum and Wukari. Its influence stretches through the upper Benue Valley, around present-day Taraba, and westward through the Middle Benue, including areas that today fall within Benue and Nasarawa, with connections extending toward the Niger-Benue confluence, around present-day Kogi. But here is the important part. Kwarafa was not simply one modern ethnic group. It was a complex political formation involving different communities, and the land we call Benue State today had different names and identities long before modern state boundaries existed. The Middle Benue was associated in different traditions with Apa, while northern historical sources refer to the wider political formation as Kororofa or Kwararafa. Kwarafa did not disappear in one single year. Its political power weakened through succession struggles, internal conflict, wars, and changing regional pressures, particularly from the 17th century onward. As the old political system weakened, different communities began moving away from the main center of powers, and some of these populations moved deeper into the Middle Benue Valley. One of the areas they occupied was the region we know today as Makudi. But don't imagine modern Makudi. There was no modern city, no stadium, no government house, no major roads, no Benue State. Instead, there were small settlements scattered around the river. Among the populations associated with this wider Middle Benue world were Jukun riverine communities, Idoma-related groups including Agatu communities, Etulu, and Alago populations, among others. And they had different ways of making a living. Some were fishermen. They knew the Benue River intimately. They built canoes. They fished. They transported people and goods. Others were farmers, cultivating the fertile plains beside the river. And some communities were involved in salt production and trade, especially farther across the Middle Benue and Nasarawa region. This was not one giant city. It was a network of small villages, fishing camps, farming settlements, and trading points. There was no single king sitting in a palace in what is now Makudi, controlling every village. Inasmuch as the Jukun were scattered in small settlements across the valley, they still answer to their paramount ruler and headquarters in Wukari, Taraba State. So imagine the situation, living their daily lives, fishing, farming, trading, while maintaining wider cultural and political relationships with the Jukun center at Wukari. And in different traditions, these older Middle Belt populations were remembered through names connected with Apa and Kwararafa. But then, another major population movement was already underway. The Tiv were not originally concentrated throughout the central Benue plains. Their tradition traced their earlier movement through the eastern frontier and Nigerian-Cameroon borders, including the region associated with Swen. From there, Tiv-speaking communities gradually moved westward and northward. By the 18th and especially 19th centuries, Tiv expansion into the Benue plains became increasingly significant. And when they arrived, they did not enter an empty land. They encountered older communities already living there. The fragmented remains of Kwararafa communities lived in this region. Small Juku River settlements, Idoma-related communities, Agatu population, Etulu and Alago. Note, they were collectively called the people of Apa or the people of Kwararafa. Some called them Kororofa and other Middle Benue peoples. The chiefs settled among these populations, and their greatest advantage was something very simple: farming. They needed land, they cleared forests, they planted crops, they established new compounds and settlements, and generations after generations, the chief population expanded across the fertile Benue plains. And now, the story becomes even more dramatic. In 1804, Osman Dan Fodio launched the jihad that transformed the political landscape of northern Nigeria. The Sokoto Revolution eventually produced powerful emirates and military network that pushed southward during the 19th century. The Middle Benue became a place for slave taking, raiding, warfare, and competition for trade routes made many exposed communities increasingly vulnerable. Some populations moved away from exposed areas, some sought safer settlements, some consolidated themselves into thief settlements for safety, and the thieves were also expanding at the same time. And they resisted attempts by northern forces to establish large political control over large portions of their homeland. Their decentralized society could mobilize large numbers of kinsmen through lineage alliance. There was no single thief king commanding everyone. Instead, families, lineages, then kindred could mobilize when communities were threatened. This made thief communities extremely difficult to subdue. Over generations, the demographic balance changed dramatically. The thief became one of the dominant populations across much of what is today central Benue. But here is something fascinating. The older populations did not simply disappear. Their descendants survived. Their cultures survived. Their languages survived. And sometimes their place names survived. By the colonial period, thief society was undergoing another major transformation. Traditionally, thief political organization was based heavily on lineages and local authorities, rather than a single centralized monarchy. Then, in 1946, the British colonial administration recognized the Totiv institution. His Royal Majesty Maki Zakwe became the first Totiv. This gave the Tiv a recognized paramount institution capable of representing the wider Tiv population. And politically, this was extremely important. But we must be very careful here. The creation of the Totiv did not legally hand ownership of Makudi to the Tiv people, nor did it erase the traditional identities of other communities. No. Rather, it strengthened Tiv political coordination and representation during the late colonial period. Meanwhile, Makudi itself was changing. The railway, the river, trade, colonial administration, and later roads and bridges were transforming the old river settlement into a growing center. People from different parts of Nigeria came to Makudi: Tiv, Idoma, Jukun, Hausa, Igbo, and many others. That is how the ancient river landscape gradually became the modern city we know today. So who is the owner of Benue State? The answer is much more complicated than you think. The Benue Valley was shaped by many centuries of migration, settlements, farming, fishing, warfare, trade, and political change. Before the major thief expansion, the region was already controlled by part of the wider Kwararafa Confederacy, not by a single ethnic group. Kwararafa was a major political force. The Jukun were central to its political world. Idoma-related, Agatu, Alago, Etulu, and other communities occupied different parts of the Middle Benue. Yet, under administration of Kwararafa, then thief populations expanded. Then, 19th century warfare transformed the region again. Then, colonial rule drew new administrative boundaries. And eventually, in 1976, Benue State was created with Makudi as its capital. So modern Benue is not the story of one people replacing another overnight. It is the story of layers of people, migrations, and civilizations built upon one another. On our next episode, we will talk about the reason behind naming in Benue State. See you on our next video.